Today, let's talk about the two syllabic writing systems of Japan, the Kana, i.e. Hiragana and Katakana. And let's ask ourselves the question if there's any connection to Sanskrit, in other words, India. Well, not a direct one. The Kana originated from Chinese characters. How exactly we shall see, but there was one major influence, Buddhism. Buddhism came to Japan from India via China and Korea, and left an indelible mark upon Japanese culture. Also on the Kana. Now, how? Everyone who's studied Kana should be familiar with a curious grid within which the syllables are contained. I've henceforth coloured Hiragana red and Katakana blue. Hiragana are the syllabic characters to write grammatical endings or rarer words with, whilst Katakana are usually reserved for loan words from Portuguese, English and so forth. The phonetic grid, the notorious Akasatana Hamayarawan, is almost completely regular because it's multiplied in a sense by the 5 final vowels A, I, U, E, O. Notice by the way that the Japanese U is weak and centered, so more like the short English U in put than, say, the long U in coup d'etat. Just a few of these syllables are seemingly irregular. Yi, ye, wu seem to be missing, but that's simply due to the fact that the y, the y, is essentially a consonantal I and I, just like the w is a consonantal u, and they hence rarely met or were simplified if they did. S, T and P sounds also underwent some minor changes. T, for example, became chi. Well, that is exactly parallel to what happens when a Brit pronounces Tuesday, as opposed to the more American Tuesday. This is called palatalization and or assimilation, very frequent processes throughout a multitude of languages where T or K-like sounds become hissy or chewy, for example in front of fronted vowels such as an I. Palatalization and assimilation with a B are both assimilation with an M phenomena. Sounds that meet in a word tend to rub off on each other. Another thing that happened in early Japanese was that the P became very, very weak. This is also not unheard of. There's, for example, no P in Arabic. Reconstructible P's became F's in Arabic as well as in Japanese. The Japanese F is, however, not an English F. It's bilabial, so the lower lip does not touch the upper teeth. It's really just a voiceless W, somewhat comparable to how many English speakers pronounce the wh and say what or where, whu, whu. This weak sound even tends to become an H or disappear altogether in Japanese. A similar thing happened in Old Irish, by the way. Old P's became wh and subsequently disappeared altogether as well. A good example is Irish Gaelic ahir, that corresponds to English father, Italian padre, and so on. It simply means father, but without the F or P that we see in English or Italian. All those languages are related. A good indicator for St. Patrick not being an original Irishman, by the way. He came from Britain, after all. Had he been Irish himself, he'd have probably been called something like Ahric. Now what we saw just a minute ago was the basic Kana grid. There are more Kanas, such as the voiced ones we see here. They're usually just the unvoiced ones, plus a diacritic consisting of 2 short strokes. Notice that there is also a P row. The diacritic is a small circle instead of 2 strokes, but we just said that original P's either changed or disappeared in Japanese, right? Well, they can resurface, or rather remain, under specific circumstances that we'll touch upon in a second. But let's first develop the grid for these voiced sounds. It's again quite regular. However, again, we do see some palatalization and or assimilation going on. This is no news. Just like a speaker of British English pronounces Tuesday as Tuesday, they'd also pronounce dubious as dubious. Voice is no obstacle to the aforementioned sound changes. What happened to the P's though? Well, one if not the major source of P retention are the numerous words of Chinese origin in Japanese. Japanese proper and Chinese proper are as distinct as English and Japanese, but China's classical influence was immense, and so Japanese borrowed heavily from Chinese. In fact, classical Chinese used to be the vehicle of literacy in Korea, Japan and Vietnam for centuries, just like Latin was in Europe, or Arabic in the Middle East, or Sanskrit and Pali in South and Southeast Asia. In fact, the new and the old capitals' names, Tokyo and Kyoto, are indeed Chinese. However, not modern Beijing Mandarin Chinese, rather firstly borrowed from a different, more southern Chinese dialect, secondly borrowed many centuries ago when the words were different in Chinese itself, and thirdly Japonicized, in other words pronounced assuming a more typically Japanese mouth position and hence more along the lines of the Japanese sound system. Now, some of these words borrowed from Chinese ended in p or t, which does not happen in Mandarin, but we can still hear those trailing consonants in, say, Cantonese. The first syllables in the two examples on the screen ended in such consonants. Hence, kappa simply remained kappa, and kappu was assimilated into kappu. The P never had the chance to weaken and disappear, since it was strong enough in conjunction with another brotherly consonant by its side. However, when these very syllables stood alone or at the end of words, they underwent the aforementioned changes. Japanese doesn't like final consonants, so an auxiliary u or I was attached at the end. P's became weak and waned between vowels, and T's underwent Tuesday changes. This is then the very reason for the Japanese Kana practice to write double consonants with a small ts. Well, it oftentimes was a ts, or rather its predecessors t in classical Japanese, or t in Chinese if the word was a borrowing. Finally, the syllables ending in I can combine with ya, yu, yo to produce syllables such as ko or ya. Really, the y, the y, palatalizes the consonant just before it. In other words, the consonant assumes the quality of the y, of the y. Is thus not just an added y. It's not kyo or ryo, it's kyo or ryo. The two consonants actually meld and melt together. For specific sounds, more specifically the dentals such as S or T, the palatalization goes a tad further, producing hissy sounds. It's essentially the same Tuesday phenomenon we already encountered. This very fact will become interesting later on when we'll speak of the influence of Sanskrit on the Kana system. These Y-otated sounds, hence y or y containing syllables, are usually of Chinese origin. But there are a few cases where genuinely Japanese sound combinations morphed into them. Have a look at the syllable sequence on the screen. Kepupa gradually became kyowa, which means today in modern Japanese. How? Well, the P weakened and the vowels surrounding it coalesced, whereas the lonely P at the beginning of the frequently used topical particle was only weakened to the point of w and did not completely disappear. This is hence the very reason for the seemingly irregular pronunciation of the syllable ha as wa in this one word. When speaking of the history of Kana, we have to mention three earlier stages: Mangyōngana, Hentaingana, and Kuntang. They were essentially kanji, that is full Chinese characters, used predominantly for phonetic purposes instead of their meaning, then cursive or sloppy kanji, and abbreviated kanji, used for annotating Chinese texts, respectively. The cursive or sloppy Hentaingana versions of entire Mangyōngana kanji used for the phonetic value are thus the precursors to modern-day Hiragana. If you pause the video and examine the in-between stages coloured in brighter red here, you can clearly see how kanji evolved into the seemingly very differently looking Hiragana. The cursive proto-kana we just saw were by no means the only ones used throughout history. They number in the hundreds, derived from a multitude of very different but oftentimes homophonous kanji. Katakana, on the other hand, usually evolved from abbreviated kanji, used for the aforementioned kuntang annotation of classical Chinese texts, where a specific element of the original character, or the entire character in case it was already simple enough, turned into a simplified version of it. Again, ultimately used purely for its phonetic value. I've coloured the crucial elements bright red once more. This then after protracted and tumultuous periods of experimentation and consolidation, eventually gave rise to the 48 Hiragana and 48 Katakana characters we know and love today. Two of them, the wi and we, are obsolete today. Again, usually hailing from the realms of weak P's turning into wh-like sounds and ultimately disappearing for good. We can now nicely juxtapose Hiragana and Katakana with the kanji they originated from, and perhaps cycle back and forth between the tables for a bit of dramatic effect. But yes, back to Buddhism, and hence the influence of Indic culture, Indic thought, and apparently even Indic script onto East Asia. What about it? The history of South and Southeast Asia is generally speaking quite distinct from the history of East Asia, but they did intersect, of course. As far as writing is concerned, and writing has always been a solid vehicle for culture, religion, and of course literary tradition, the enormous multitude of scripts used from India through Thailand, all the way to even Indonesia and the Philippines, well before the advent of the Latin script there, can be traced back to the so-called Brāhmī script, popularized by King Ashoka, who used it to in turn popularize Buddhism throughout Greater India in the 3rd century BC. That script soon forked into the Grantha variety in the south and the Gupta one in the north. One northern Gupta variant in particular, the so-called Siddham script, made its way into East Asia and is still used for calligraphic purposes to some extent. This then is Brāhmī, as used more than 2,000 years ago. Its shapes were usually hewn in stone, notoriously onto pillars, monumentalizing Ashoka's conquests and missionary efforts. Buddhism thus wasn't always the laid-back, non-religious religion we perceive it as today, by the way. When Brāhmī veered south, it gave rise to the scripts of southern India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. We see the Cambodian Khmer or Khmer script on the screen. In the north, its Gupta variety gave rise to the scripts of Bangladesh, the Punjab, and of course Hindustan proper. What we see here is the Devanagari script, commonly used for writing, for example, Hindi, Nepali, Marathi, Sanskrit and Pali. Sanskrit and Pali being the two vehicular languages of Buddhism. The more north, the more Sanskrit, the more south, the more Pali. Both Sanskrit and Pali could be, were, and are indeed couched in numerous Indic scripts. The one that came to be predominantly used for writing Sanskrit in the northeast was the aforementioned Siddham we see here now, in all its glory. You'll have noticed that all of them can be, and usually are, ordered along the lines of a peculiar grid, or a matrix. This matrix was developed by Indian grammarians, such as Panini, who were amongst the first to recognize phonetic regularities in sounds, morphological regularities in forms, words, word roots, etc., and meticulously systematizing them 2.5 millennia ago. What we see here is the usual way of transcribing those core sounds in Indology, most of which are also commonly represented by the numerous Indic scripts. We'll not go into all the Indic particulars here, let's merely concentrate on the core of the core, the 25 basic consonants, essentially stops and nasals. The columns designate different manners of articulation, whereas the rows designate different places of articulation. Places or spots in the mouth, of course. The manners of phonation are not as important in the Japanese context because Japanese sports a much simpler phonetic makeup, but Indic languages have voiceless, voiceless aspirated, voiced, even voiced aspirated stops, such as the D in Buddha, as well as nasal M&N-like sounds. When it comes to the places of articulation, as represented by the rows of the grid though, their traditional order is by no means chaotic. It gradually moves from the back of the mouth, where K-like sounds are produced, towards the very front of the mouth, i.e. the lips, where P-like sounds are produced. Whereas in between, we get the various Ch or T-like sounds, including, by the way, a very specifically Indic and Dravidian row of so-called retroflex sounds, produced with the tip of the tongue rolled back towards the top of the mouth. D, D, N. This is exactly what linguists do when classifying and categorizing all human speech sounds. Familiarizing oneself with the so-called IPA, not the beer, well, that too, but rather and specifically the International Phonetic Alphabet, parts of it rendered here, is definitely a splendid idea if you want to delve into phonetics. The Indic matrix was then filled up with vowels, semivowels, and other somewhat weaker sounds than the core stops we just saw in the beginning. Again, it would unfortunately take up too much time, for our current purposes at least, to explain all the details, but suffice to say that all sounds are neatly fitted and moulded into the aforementioned grid, essentially a times table, timesing manner with place of articulation, moving from the very back of the mouth to its front. As alluded to, Japanese merely required a select few of those Indic sounds. We can see that all the aspirated, retroflex, additional vowel, additional S-like or sibilant sounds were discarded with. Japanese grammarians moved even a tad further. The voiced sounds were close enough to their voiceless counterparts so as not to necessitate a separate glyph. P became weak, yielding H, F or F-like sounds, and S and T were deemed similar enough to the Indic ch, usually just transcribed with a C, so as to coalesce with each other. Remember the Tuesday phenomenon. Some other tweaks were applied then, and what we can clearly already see emerge is the Kasatana Hamayarawan grid Japanese Kana are pressed into. It's simply a simplified version of the original, more elaborate Indic matrix. Japanese then did not veer from the traditional Chinese path of segmenting speech into syllables, rather than individual sounds. You might have noticed that the Indic grid was also about syllables, such as ka, ta, pa, not the very consonants k, t, p. Syllabification was indeed deeply ingrained into earlier traditions. Sounds were ultimately only construed as constituents of naturally occurring syllables. Indic alphabets, or rather more precisely Abugidas, dealt with the issue of rendering syllables with a vowel different to a short a by adding diacritics in front, above, below, or after the basic character. That again on its own usually designates a syllable with an inherent a. Japanese, however, applied the 5 basic vowels as an additional times category to the times table and filled it up with a kana descended from kanji we caught a glimpse at earlier on. Now, since Japanese did not carry over the voiced grid category from the Indic matrix, it reintroduced it by recognizing g, z, d and b as merely the voiced counterparts of k, s, d, p, especially since voiceless sounds can often change into voiced ones between words or other morphemes, a process known as Rendaku. By the way, the very same process responsible for why we say Hiragana or Hiragana with a g or ng depending on preference, but Katakana, Katakana with a k. The voiced counterparts are therefore just diacriticized versions of the original kana, denoting voiceless sounds, as we already saw. We also already saw that original P's usually softened up into weaker sounds, but were retained in specific contexts. This is thus why an H, an F, a P and a B form a single kana family. And finally, we also already saw how contact with an I or a Y made teethy dental sounds exhibit Tuesday-like phenomena. This is hence the reason for the Japanese conflation of the original Indic ch with an S and putting its row right next to the T row that can also Tuesday around, if you will. With that, we've now completed a full circle. We're now armed with an idea for why the Japanese kana are ordered in a peculiar fashion and why some of them are pronounced seemingly irregularly. It was the sophisticated application of an originally Indic phonological grid to syllabic Japanese characters derived from Chinese. And in Chinese, originally logosyllabic characters, so characters with a meaning and a sound. And the subsequent, relentless wheel of time, and thus phonetic as well as graphical changes. We also saw how kana are ultimately nothing but cursive or simplified versions of kanji that came to be used phonetically irrespective of meaning, although Japanese of course notoriously retains kanji for both semantic and phonetic purposes, alongside their sister products, the Hiragana and Katakana syllabaries. We noticed that the original legions of Mangyōgana and Hentaigana were reduced to a handy number of kana, and some went out of use for practical or phonetic reasons. We then saw that the Japanese imploded the original Indic sound matrix due to fewer sounds to be represented, but re-exploded the grid again by adding syllable final vowels as a distinctive category, and also by signifying voice or retained P's with mere diacritics. And yes, an almost entirely parallel grid of Y-otated syllables, that is, ones with Y-like components, emerged, especially due to the numerous loans from Chinese that were rich in such sounds, but also due to phonetic phenomena within Japanese itself. All that's left to do for us for now is to marvel at a Hiragana grid arranged by similarity, because at the end of the day you still have to learn the characters, and many of them look remarkably similar to each other. This, by the way, is a common phenomenon in writing systems. They tend to employ reappearing graphical elements, just like the Latin letters B, D, P and Q are essentially differently mirrored versions of the same glyph if you really think about it. We'll not forget about katakana, that are becoming more and more visible throughout Japanese texts due to the vast number of English loanwords in modern Japanese that are usually written in katakana. The internal logic, graphical elements and history of katakana is quite different to the one of hiragana, as we briefly saw earlier on. And that's that for today. Cheers!